Okay, greetings and welcome to this video. This is looking at the EU. It's part of the relationship between branches module, and I'm here with Ria today, who's going to be helping us learn about the EU. We're going to be finding out what it is, how it's changed over time, the impact it's had on the UK, some of its key policies and its aims, and the impact of Brexit on the EU as well. So,
Okay, so the EU, it was created in 1957 after World War II as kind of like a peace treaty, but it involved trading, so it meant that other countries were dependent on each other, so they wouldn't like betray each other or whatever.
So by having kind of trade, it meant that there was a kind of a mutual benefit in them kind of staying together. Then as you get into the 1960s, the EU countries dropped charging custom duties. That means when you kind of take one good from one country to another, it meant you no longer had to pay extra money to that country to do so. And it also was the first time that they worked together over food production. And for the first ever time, there was surplus food. And if you know anything about that era of history, you'll know that starvation was a real problem, hunger was a real problem. And the EU was one of the reasons why people actually had enough to eat.
We joined in 1973 because our economy was very bad.
So bad.
Very bad.
So bad.
And this ensured that we'd be able to raise our economy and get it back to a good position.
Definitely become a lot more competitive. Over time, the EU became a lot more powerful and had a lot more influence. And one of the big things that changed its influence was when the EU Parliament became directly elected. The EU Parliament had existed for quite a number of years by 1979, but it was appointed by the government. And in 1979, those members became directly elected, which is why we now have EU elections. Because they were directly elected, they had legitimacy, they had a mandate, and the EU Parliament itself started to make a lot more decisions in a lot more areas because they felt they had democratic legitimacy to be able to do so. And one of the areas where they started producing more laws was in the environment. They started kind of limiting the amount of pollution that a business could produce, or the amount of, or how they had to treat animals, or things like that, or laws to do with pesticides. So what does the EU actually aim to do?
So, peace. After World War II, they tried to not have another big war. So their main aim was peace, to ensure that all countries got along, and trading ensured that.
When I went to the EU exhibition last year, which I would thoroughly recommend you guys go to, the first wall you see as you go through is all about the various wars that have existed between countries. Not just World War II, but all of the other wars that have taken place. And they very much kind of make out that by creating the EU, they kind of brought these countries together in a peaceful way rather than a competitive way. There was a really cheesy analogy, which was if you hug your enemy close, you can't punch them because you're hugging them so tightly. It's cheesy, but that's kind of the idea behind the EU. Freedom is an important part of it. Freedom to trade and freedom of individuals. You can't be a member of the EU if you've got a dictator running your country, and you also can't discriminate against another country. You have to trade justly. So that was another key aim of the EU. The EU is very much a capitalist organisation. It's built on the idea of economic growth through competition. So it's not a socialist organisation or an organisation that's based around making everyone equal, but it's based around equal opportunity or equal access to a common market. As part of that, because it has so many countries involved, one of their aims is also to combat discrimination. And the example here, as I've given, is racism. Now, whilst they can't make laws in particular on racism, what they can do is say that when you're trading, you cannot discriminate against certain groups, or when you're buying, you cannot discriminate against certain manufacturers. It also promotes technology, which is probably just behind Ria's head here, which is the use of advanced technology in business. It's not a particularly important point for an essay, but it is one of their key ideas.
Respect cultural diversity. So as all the countries came together, they were worried that diversity would be lost. So in order to reassure that it wasn't, each country still has their own like kind of thing that's significant to them.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, drinking pints at the bar,
Yeah.
the EU wanted to restrict that, or they wanted to show people how
like
much
liters or something like that. Yeah.
So, but the UK argued that it's part of our culture to have pints,
To have a pint,
and not have liters. So yeah.
And the EU then respected that, and so on. So the idea is that every culture doesn't disappear by joining the EU. It's that these different cultures work together. One of the other aims, which has been partially fulfilled, is a single currency, which obviously links to economic growth and competition and so on, and which led to the creation of the euro in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Britain, of course, and other countries decided not to join it, but any new members of the EU must join the euro. So for argument's sake, if we were to leave and rejoin in the future, it's highly likely that we would be asked or told that part of the deal for rejoining would be to join the EU. The other aim of the EU is what's become known as the four freedoms, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. The four freedoms are the four key principles of the single market, and we'll discuss what they are in a second. But when David Cameron went to renegotiate with the EU back in 2015, before the referendum, he kept coming up against these four freedoms, because he would say, well, can we change this and can we change that? And the answer was often, well, no, because they're part of the four key freedoms, the four key principles of the EU. Like in Islam, you have I think it's the 5 pillars, and in Christianity, you've got the 10 commandments. In the EU, you've got the four freedoms. These are almost like the sacred beliefs of the EU, if it was a religion. Are you doing this one, Roma? Apparently I'm doing it. Okay, so one of the four freedoms is the free movement of people. So this is the idea that any EU citizen has the right to move and live in any other country, which leads to mass migration. It means that you, as an EU citizen, depending on if you're watching this before or after the 31st of January, can go and work in any other EU country, and they have to treat you equally to any other applicant when they're looking at the people that have applied for the job. It was one of the things that David Cameron wanted to change, but was unable to, because the free movement of people is one of the four key freedoms.
Free movement of goods. So if you make goods in this country, or if it's made in another country, you can go to that country, or they can come to us without any border control. So it's just easier for goods to be moved back and forth.
It's one of the things that might change when we leave the EU, about how we can move goods around. Free movement of money. This is the idea that you can invest in any company in any of those nations. You can use any bank, any kind of financial institution. It's all based on kind of like trading and things like that. But the idea so far, as you can see, that people can go anywhere, goods can go anywhere, money can go anywhere, and
free movement of services. So if you make a company here, you can make branches in other EU countries, or you can offer your services to other EU countries. So if you're an accountant, you can be an accountant in Spain or France or whatever.
Without even leaving this country. So you can work for or be appointed by businesses that kind of go elsewhere. And together, these are the four freedoms, the four key principles. And when David Cameron was trying to renegotiate, he wanted to keep free movement of services. I'm not sure where these are above my head now. Free movement of services, free movement of money, and free movement of goods. He wanted to change free movement of people. And he was told, this is a package. If you want to change that one, then you've got to get rid of the other ones too. And together, these are known as the single market, which often you see on the news. Now, you also need to know some of the key EU policies, so we've talked about their aims, but what specifically have they actually done, and what effect have they actually had? And we're going to go through some examples here.
So international trade. If you're a Remainer, you would argue that 40% is a high amount, and it's higher than any other trade percentage we have of any other country. But if you're a Brexiteer, you would argue that 40% isn't over 50%. So therefore, it doesn't really matter. But our international trade has really gone up with the EU being involved, and it's really benefited us. And consumer safety. So there are standards on products. So chargers, they have to have an automatic system where they turn off after 30 minutes if they're not being used. And stuff like food. There was one about bananas, if they're not curved enough, then they can't be sold. But yeah, stuff like that.
So having those directives has definitely kind of changed the standards of products. That means that if you buy a product that was made in another country in the EU, you should know that it should be safe, because we all have the same directives and the same instructions. Another key EU policy is, of course, the single market, which you mentioned with the four freedoms. The result of this is that the borders between countries have been almost removed. If you drive in a vehicle from France to Germany, sometimes you don't even notice that you've changed country. There'll be a sign perhaps, and maybe your phone will bleep and say, "Oh, hi, you've changed country," or whatever. But actually, you don't have passport checks. No one kind of looks to see what you're kind of carrying across, because the borders between these countries have nearly been gone. The UK has actually always been slightly removed from that, in that we do always keep our passport control. However, the UK is not allowed to deny entry to EU citizens unless there's a security risk or something like that. But the vast majority of those borders are now gone. Two key policies that you should probably know a bit about is the Common Agricultural Policy and the Common Fisheries Policy. I'll attach a link to this video where you can read an interesting article about what they do. But these have been very controversial and are some of the key reasons why some people want to leave. The Common Agricultural Policy basically promotes EU industries over others, especially in the world of agriculture. Now, UK farmers spend a lot of money making their goods because we are quite a rich country. It costs farmers quite a lot to make their goods, which means when they go and sell them on the market, they're not competitive because the price they need to sell them for is more than the price that, say, a third world country can sell their goods for. So what the Common Agricultural Policy does is it provides subsidies, i.e. money, to those industries that might otherwise struggle. So although we give a lot of money to the EU, a lot of that money is then given back to our various agricultural industries, as well as the industries across the whole of the EU. And the Common Agricultural Policy does things like fixes the prices, supports certain industries, invests in certain industries at the expense of other businesses outside. Read the article to find out more. The Common Fisheries Policy is the idea that every EU nation is allowed to fish effectively anywhere in the EU. There's a 12-mile border which is exclusively belongs to that country. So within 12 miles of Britain, only British boats can ship there. But anywhere outside of that, even if it's technically British waters, any boat is allowed to fish there. And that's caused quite a lot of controversy because it has affected the ability of certain British fishermen to be able to catch enough fish because there have been Spanish fishermen there or whatever. Just as a little aside though, non-trade related issues like education and health aren't impacted by the EU because that doesn't really involve the creation of goods. So most of the EU policies will affect something being produced or made or some sort of service or things like that. So what is the impact of the EU? Like what changes has it actually brought to Britain since we joined 50 years ago?
So workers' rights. So if you go to work in another EU country, you will have the same rights that you have in the UK. So sick pay, holiday pay, and the right to create a union.
Yeah.
So you all have all those rights, so you'll still be protected.
And they were controversial when they first came in because it meant that we had to extend our rights in the UK as well to make sure. I think Margaret Thatcher in particular was unhappy about it because it meant that, because Margaret Thatcher didn't like unions, but the European Social Charter meant that she had to give certain unions rights. But it means wherever you work in the EU, in theory, you have the same rights. Devolution has been affected hugely. Now, because of the four freedoms, it means that Northern Ireland and Ireland are effectively able to act as one economic country. Although Northern Ireland is technically part of the UK and Ireland is not, they can remove that border because freedom of movement of people, freedom of goods, freedom of services, etc., etc. And it's one of the things that has helped to bring peace to Northern Ireland, because if you are what you call a loyalist or a nationalist, you can kind of pretend you are in Ireland. But if you're a unionist, then you still know you're part of the UK. So it's definitely been very useful for peace in Northern Ireland that the EU has allowed, the creation of the EU and our membership of the EU has allowed these borders to come down. Sovereignty has been affected. Now, the reason I've got a fishing boat here is because there was a famous case involving the Common Fisheries Policy, which I mentioned in the previous slide. It's called the Factor-Tame case, and a Spanish firm called Factor-Tame sued the British government saying that we were preventing them from fishing in their waters, which we were. We made a law. It's called something like the. Can you find the name of the law that we made?
The Merchant Shipping Act.
Thank you. The Merchant Shipping Act. We made a law that basically said only British fishermen can fish in our waters. And then we were taken to court, and the court ruled that EU law was superior to UK law. And this was a big deal because it was the first time that actually a UK law had been struck down by an EU law, which is something you're more used to seeing in the kind of the US. So the Factor-Tame case, which is one you should definitely know about, so go and read a little bit about it. It's in all the textbooks. reinforced the idea that EU was sovereign above the UK Parliament. Public opinion has been massively changed by the EU. Think about all the Brexit debates we've been having for the last few years. The various political parties that have kind of come up. Some people are very, very pro-EU, some people are very anti-it, but obviously public opinion has been changed by membership of the EU, as have some communities. The freedom of movement and the freedom of services has led to certain communities having huge amounts of immigration and migration. There are now lots of places in the UK, like where I live, where you get lots of shops that actually have a different kind of nationality. You get different kind of communities have been changed by people migrating from different kind of countries. And this has led some people to be like, this is fantastic. And it's led other people to be like, I don't like the way my community has changed. But membership of the EU has changed communities. I thought you were doing this one.
I think I'll do the next.
Oh, okay. We'll do this one anyway.
Okay, so the Conservative Party, EU has kind of taken down a lot of Conservative Party leaders. So Theresa May, David Cameron, Thatcher.
Yeah.
All
of them, really.
Yeah. The only reason that Boris Johnson is the leader right now is because of his views on the EU, his strong opinions on Wales. Other parties, so Labour, Jeremy Corbyn was very centre, so he didn't say whether he wanted to remain or leave. And parties have been created because of EU. So UKIP,
Brexit Party. But it's had a huge impact on UK politics. You've got things like the ERG, so you've got like factions in various parties as well. It's had a big impact on. So looking at this slide as a whole, the EU has had a huge impact on UK life, which is again one of the reasons why people have such strong opinions of it. Which is why Brexit has happened. Now, what will the impact of Brexit be? Now, one of the big impacts will be an economic one, but I haven't put on this slide because we don't really know what the economic change will be. Will it be good? Will it be bad? There's arguments on both sides. We don't know. It's an unknown. So I've tried on this slide to kind of tell us the things that we kind of know for sure will happen, and most of them are kind of politically based. So the first one is that EU laws will no longer apply to the UK. If you remember the Brexit campaign, the Brexiteers were always saying, let's take back control. And so that factor 10 case, where the EU law struck down a UK law, will no longer apply. So our money, our economy, our borders, our security, our taxes, all those kind of things, the EU laws will no longer apply. Now, they may still apply because one of the things Theresa May was talking about was actually taking all of the EU laws and on bulk putting them all into UK law. So they become UK laws, and then she was going to kind of take away some kind of one by one as they kind of go. But it certainly means that EU laws will no longer be sovereign over us.
So the four freedoms will no longer apply, but that's unless there is a trading deal which is made, which requires one of the four freedoms or all of them to still be in place.
What was the four freedoms?
Freedom of movement, freedom of moving goods, freedom of banks and money.
Yep.
And freedom of services.
Freedom of services. If Boris Johnson gets a deal that's very, very close to the EU, some of those freedoms might still apply. If he goes for something that's quite distant, then they probably won't. UK citizens will no longer have the right to work in the EU and vice versa. Now, you can still go, but you'll have to get a visa. You might have to leave after a certain period of time. You might not get the same rights when you kind of go there, things like that. But so it will certainly change the ability of UK citizens to go there and for EU citizens to come here.
So borders in Northern Ireland, they will be put back in place, which could cause conflict again. So EU reinsured that those borders wouldn't be there anymore, but once Brexit happens, they'll be put back.
Potentially put back. So it's controversial. It may be put back. There's people kind of saying, well, will it happen? Will it not happen? But technically it should, because there should now be a customs zone there. Devolution and Scottish independence. This was in the news today when we're filming this video, is that the SNP have said, well, Scotland voted to stay in the EU, so why should we be taking it out of the EU against our will? So the case for independence or another independence referendum has become far stronger, and it may well happen, although at the moment Boris Johnson is saying no. And there's also an unknown political impact. I mean, we have the Brexit Party and we have UKIP, but will there be the creation of a party that wants to rejoin the EU, whatever it might be called? What will happen to the Conservative Party? Will they remain split over the EU, or will they become kind of content to be out? What will happen to the Labour Party? What happens to the Lib Dems, who was a huge kind of Remain party? You know, what will happen to politics in this country? I can't tell you what the impact will be, but there will certainly be an impact. So that's the EU. I think the next slide is something a little bit different. Yes, it is. So that's the EU. We've talked about what it is, we've talked about the impact, we've talked about the impact of Brexit, and we've talked about the policies. Massive thank you to Ria for becoming an international superstar on this video. Hope you find it useful, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.